The eyes of Jesus. We began a series of lessons this morning. Appreciate Steve leading us in that song, Oh, to Be Like Thee. That will take us through the next 2 weeks well, 3 weeks altogether, this week and then 2 more, of talking about some of the features of Jesus in an effort to, oh, to be like thee. Story is told of a young man and his father that had gone into a museum, and they were looking at a masterpiece, much like this one. And as they were looking at this masterpiece, the young boy, who was an artist to a degree, trying to become better, said to his father, Dad, I would love to have his ability. His ability in color and in space and in subject matter, to be able to paint like him and to paint great works of art. And his father put his arm around his young son, and he looked at him and he said, you said you can. He says, but here's the thing you have to do. And the son, was interested in what his dad had to say, and he said, you have to get his eyes first. And once you get his eyes, you'll have that same ability as well as you develop and hone your craft. Well, there's a lot of truth to that. As we think about Jesus and think about the life that he lived, we understand that as Christians, it is our responsibility to become like Jesus. That we are, as Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18, that we are to be made into his image, into his likeness. And when you think about that, and we all understand that as Christians, for we understand that really that is what God expects of us, to be more like Jesus. Yet in the same vein, in the same thought, we have to say, well, how do we do that? Well, I think one of the ways is to study Jesus. To look at Jesus and to become like him, we have to see what he did, how he acted, what he thought. And I think one of the ways of doing that is to look at, if you will, some of his body parts. Today, this morning, I want to look at the eyes of Jesus. Tonight, I want to look at the ears of Jesus. Now, we admittedly, we don't know the eyes of Jesus. We don't know what color they were for sure. We don't know how far apart they were. We don't know, if you will, what shape they were. We don't know that. But we do know some, and we're not going to be able to talk about all the things, but we want to look at some of the things that Jesus with his eyes did and saw. Because it is those things that he touched. It is those things that he affected. And it is those things that ultimately give us great insights into what our eyes and as we talk about ears, and our hands and our feet, what they should be doing as well to be just like Jesus. When we think about the eyes of Jesus, the first thing, at least, that comes to mind is the story found in the book of John, the first chapter, and verse 43 beginning. It's the story of when Philip comes to Nathanael and he says, we have found the Messiah. He says, we found him from Nazareth. And Nathanael says, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? Well, Philip had said, we found him from Nazareth. We found him whom Moses and the prophets wrote about. And Nathanael, in his disdain, basically says nothing good can come out of Nazareth. And Philip says, come and see. Great invitation. Come and see. Great invitation for all of us to think about with regards to offering it to others. Come and see. Come and see us. You hear a lot of folks talk about Church Christ. Well, come and see. Philip tells that to Nathanael, and Nathanael does. He's expecting really to find really nothing, but he finds one that as he's walking towards him, Jesus praises him. And then he tells them, as he praises him, Nathanael wants to know, he says, how did you know about me? And Jesus says, before you came, while you were under the fig tree, I saw you. His eyes were searching. His eyes were searching, and he said, I saw you even before you came. You might say, well, preacher, that's a miracle. Yes, but his eyes were always searching. Jesus' eyes were constantly searching for folks that he could talk to, folks that he could spend time with. Jesus was always searching. His eyes were always searching as he found the 12 apostles. And he called them basically to come and follow him and be with him. Jesus' eyes were searching when he saw the widow Nain and realized that she was alone. Jesus' eyes were searching when he raised Jairus' daughter. Jesus' eyes were searching. He was constantly looking. What was he looking for? Well, he was looking for followers. He was looking for people that would listen. He was looking for folks that he could talk to. He was looking for harvesters that would go out and not just, if you will, sow the seed, but also reap that seed. He was searching for those that wanted to listen to his message and were willing to follow him. It reminds us, too, that our eyes must be searching eyes. Not only should our eyes be searching eyes that search for and search in the Scripture, but our eyes need to search for others. We are, after all, as Paul said in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 20, he says, I am an ambassador. Well, when you look at that, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But Paul talks about, beginning in verse 18, praying always with all prayer and supplication. And we look at that and we say, okay, we understand prayer and supplication, the idea of appealing to God. But then he says in verse 19, that the mystery of God may be known through me. Here's what Paul says, pray for me so that I can share God's message. The mystery, the word mystery, we've talked about it here recently before. The word mystery we think of from a standpoint of an old story that's told in a paperback book somewhere where no one knows the answer, or you don't know the answer till the last chapter or the last few pages of the book. But the word mystery, the Greek word mysterion, is the idea of that which was hidden but is now revealed. And so that which was hidden, if you will, was the gospel, but as Paul's day and age is now revealed. Paul says, I am an ambassador. You see, our searching eyes need to search as Jesus searched. To understand we are an ambassador, we are to therefore go into all the world and preach the gospel. I appreciate the fact that George prayed, and I'm looking forward to meeting Adriano and to getting to talk to him a little bit. And I'm appreciative of the fact that this congregation supports him and supports him so well. But it's not just our responsibility to contribute what we can in order to help someone go somewhere and preach the gospel. It's our personal responsibility as well. As Paul said, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. That's our responsibility. We plant, we water. And we do that by searching eyes. We do that by finding people that are interested in the truth and want to know the truth. While the preaching of the cross is to those that perish foolishness, to those of us who are being saved, it's the power of God. 1 Corinthians 1, verse 21. You see, Paul tells us there not everybody's going to listen, not everybody's going to hear, but Paul says spread it. Let it be made known. Jesus came into the world to seek and to save that which was lost, but he wanted the message to be carried forth. He wanted the message to be shared. He wanted the message to be taken to others. He gave us that responsibility. You see, we need those searching eyes, searching for that individual. We may not even know them. We may not have even met them yet. We may have only seen them once or twice. But we need to have those eyes that are searching for individuals that we can share that message with. Who can I share it with? Who, if nothing else, can I give them the invitation that Philip gave Nathanael? Come and see. We need to have those searching eyes, those eyes that Jesus had that searched out for others. But yet I'm afraid so many times we're sort of like the man that sold hot dogs during the Depression. This man was selling hot dogs right and left. It was the Depression time. He was selling hot dogs when no one else was selling hot dogs. He was selling them all day long, and he was making literally a fortune. Until finally, someone got a hold of him and said, you need to cut your hot dog order. I can't believe it's this big. And he says, why? I can sell them. I'm selling them. And they said, nobody's selling anything now. And he began to listen. And he began to cut his orders. And as he cut his orders, he cut them more and more with each passing week until finally he hardly ordered anything. And then he sat back and said, yep, we're having a depression. It's all bad. We've done that in the church. We've sat and listened and given ourselves the pat on the back. Well, I'm at church. Yes, you are, and thankful for you. But the eyes of Jesus were never satisfied with the fact of what he had and said, this is enough. Or he was searching for others to see who could help and who he could lead to him. But then secondly, the eyes of Jesus were tearful eyes. John, the 11th chapter, is probably the time that most of us are very familiar with. In John, the 11th chapter, you might remember the story of Mary and Martha being from Bethany. Bethany was not far from Jerusalem. It was just a couple of miles, really. Their brother, Lazarus, has died. Jesus receives word that Lazarus has died, and evidently Lazarus was a friend of Jesus. Instead of Jesus going immediately, what does he do? He lingers for a while. Jesus understands, and we're going to kind of paraphrase the story and cut it a little short, but Jesus understands that the power of God through him is going to be shown through the raising of Lazarus. And Jesus always understands that. Now, Mary is the one that, remember in Luke chapter 10, was sitting at the feet of Jesus while Martha was running around making sure that she was playing the good hostess and the cups were filled and everybody was happy. Well, when Jesus starts coming, Martha, she was something else. She rebukes Jesus. I mean, she's one of those ladies you probably just said, can I kind of avoid her? But Jesus tries to explain to her, your brother's not dead. You'll see him again. Well, Lord, I know I'll see him again, but it'll be the resurrection day. I want to see him now. Jesus, it's all right. It's all right. Jesus sees the tomb where Lazarus is buried. Jesus wants it opened up. Lord, he's been dead for 4 days. He's beginning to stink. Open it up. And they do. It was at that tomb, though, in John 11, verse 35. This was the memory verse that we all learned first, or I did. Jesus wept. I think there were several reasons really right there in John 11 why Jesus wept. I think he wept because here Mary and Martha really didn't understand what had happened and what was fixing to happen. I think he wept because of his friend and his friend's death. But Jesus wept. Preacher, I can't believe Jesus wept. Well, look in Luke chapter 19. Look in verse 41. Jesus is outside of the city gates looking back at Jerusalem. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, You who stoned the prophets and killed them, how often would I have gathered you together as a hen gathers her chicks, and you would not? That Jerusalem, that beloved city, Jesus cried over because it was lost and it would not listen to him. And in Hebrews chapter 5, there's another time in which the Hebrew writer tells us that Jesus wept. In the Hebrews chapter 5, beginning in verse 5 and going through verse 7, it says that Jesus, and it would be the, if you will, the Garden of Gethsemane, with vehement cries and tears. The word vehement there means the idea when Jesus cried in the garden, he didn't just boo-hoo, he let it rip. I mean, he was crying for all that he was worth. Their apprehension about what he was going through, I think so. Was there pain and agony from the standpoint of folks hadn't listened to him? And I think that would probably enter into the equation. Well, I'm not sure exactly all the emotions that Jesus felt there. But it says Jesus wept. You see, we've as a society accepted the idea big boys don't cry. There's an answer for that. It's called baloney. Big boys do cry. Our Father, our Savior, Jesus, wept. Jesus weeping teaches us that sometimes we too can weep. We can weep when we're hurting. We can weep when we're going through difficult times. Weeping is not a sign of weakness. Weeping is a sign that emotions are getting great. And it is, if you will, God's release valve that he has given to us to remove some of the pressure that we are feeling. So it's all right to cry. But we also find out from Jesus crying, from Jesus weeping, we often find out that not only is it a stress reliever, but it helps in times of grief and times of sorrow. We also find out that it is that which, if you will, from the standpoint of Luke chapter 19, it is that which we can express with regards to the lost condition of individuals. You know, sometimes we have family members that don't always take the path that we want them to take. And it's all right to cry for them. But I want you to think about, with just a few minutes from me, about the fact that Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus. I want you to think about the fact that we as individuals go through times and difficulties and heartaches, that we at times feel the pressures of life, and we need the sympathy that we can give to others. That if we're, as Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 8, that if we're to be like-minded, have the same mind, being of one accord, one compassion, that we can sit and put our arm around our brothers and sisters in Christ and weep with them when they're going through something difficult. That when they're going and facing a difficult time, maybe, like we said just a second ago, maybe their family member, their loved one is not going the way that they should go, and they're feeling that hurt, that we can put our arm around them and we can love on them and we can tell them that we love them and that we're praying for them, and we can encourage them and lift their spirits. That's what Jesus was feeling. That's why Jesus was weeping. You know, Paul reminds us in Romans chapter 12, verse 15, to rejoice with those that rejoice. But do you remember the other side of it? Weep with those that weep. I have known of individuals, and maybe you have as well, I have known of individuals that avoided the idea of weeping. They didn't like the idea of sorrow. They didn't like the idea of crying. I understand. It sometimes messes up my makeup. Joke. But the idea of weeping is Christ-centered. Little girl one time was late coming home for supper. It was in an area and in a time in which, mom could stick her head out the door and she could call out and call for supper and family would come running in. Little girl didn't. And a few minutes later, mom stuck her head out the door and she hollered for the little girl to come. And once again, the little girl didn't come. And so the family just sat down to eat. Boys were hungry. Dad was hungry. Mom was afraid what happened to the little girl. At that time, the families just sat down and ate. And so in a few minutes, the little girl came in, washed her hands, sat down. Where were you? I was down the street, Janie's. Why were you at Janie's house? You were supposed to come home after school anyway. Why were you at Janie's house? Well, I was sitting in front of Janie's house. Well, what's the problem? Well, don't you remember today we were supposed to carry things for show and tell? Yeah. Well, Janie carried a china doll that her grandmama had given her. And at the end of school, one of the bullies knocked it out of her hand and it broke. And I was sitting on the curb in front of Janie's house with Janie crying with her. That sometimes needs to be our attitude. It was Jesus' attitude. It was the way he acted and the way he reacted to others. After all, Paul said it this way, be kind one to another. We like that idea. But read the very next word, tender-hearted. It's the idea of having a heart that's touched, that's moved with the feelings of others. Jesus, his eyes sometimes were used to weep. Jesus' eyes were also lifted eyes. In John, we read in John chapter 11, verse 41, this is still in the story of Lazarus. Go back to that. Do you remember when the tomb was open? Do you remember what the text says? It says, and he lifted his eyes. It's kind of interesting because in John 17, beginning in verse 1, it says virtually the same thing. And he lifted his eyes. What was he doing both times he lifted his eyes? He was praying. He lifted his eyes towards heaven in John 11, verse 41, and he was praying. John 17 is probably the longest prayer that we have recorded of Jesus. I'm not saying it's the longest prayer of Jesus, but the one we have recorded, Jesus' prayer. Jesus spent time praying. At Jesus' baptism, isn't it interesting what he did? He prayed. When Jesus was about to choose the 12 apostles, what did he do? He prayed. When Jesus was under pressure in Matthew chapter 14 and Matthew chapter 15, what did he do? He prayed. In the Garden of Gethsemane before he died, what was he found doing? Praying. Jesus believed in prayer. And he believed in the power of prayer. He believed that it was important for him to bow his head and offer up prayers to God. You see, he believed in prayer. He believed that you should pray. And so he lifted up his eyes. Preacher, I thought you were supposed to bow your head. Every once in a while when I was a kid growing up sitting by mama at church, if I didn't bow my head, she pinched my arm. If you stop and think about it, there's no set posture for prayer. Sometimes in the Bible, with regards to prayer, they laid prostrate. Sometimes they're kneeled in prayer. Jesus lifted up his eyes. Did he do it literally, preacher? Or was it figuratively from the standpoint of, is that the way the text is being used? And while he bowed his head, he figuratively lifted up his eyes in prayer. I'm not sure. But I am sure what he was doing when he lifted his eyes. He prayed to God. We're to be individuals that are to be given to prayer. We know that. To continue instantly in prayer. 1 Corinthians 15 reminds us, Jesus reminds us in Luke 18 that men ought always pray and not to faint. We know that the early church, Acts chapter 2, they continue steadfastly in apostles' doctrine, fellowship, breaking of bread, and in what? Prayer. Prayer should be a regular part of our life. Preacher, you're preaching to the choir now. We already know that. We believe that. Amen. Keep doing it. Our eyes need to be the eyes of Jesus. They need to be lifted in prayer. Well, when do we need to pray? Well, let me ask you, or let me answer it this way by a question. When don't you need to pray? Preacher, I need to pray anytime and every time. That's right. Anytime and every time. No matter what's going on in your life, whether it's good and it's the high times or it's terrible and it's the low times, we need to pray. Whether we really need something from God or we're simply thanking Him for what we've been given, we need to lift our eyes in prayer to God. Well, sometimes, preacher, there are times in which I really don't know what to pray for. I mean, I am stumped as all get out. I have no idea. I have no clue. I just don't know. Yeah, me too. Sometimes I feel like the little girl that had gotten lost out in the woods. She kind of ran away from home and she got lost out in the woods, and at the end of the day, they'd found her. And they said, well, honey, what'd you do? She said, well, I was scared. Well, what'd you do? She said, I prayed. They said, well, what did you pray? She said, I just prayed A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J. You prayed the alphabet? She said, yeah. Well, she said, I just letting God arrange the letters to get the words right. Prayer needs to be a part of our life. It was Jesus' life. To be like Jesus, we need to pray. Jesus prayed. He lifted his eyes. And our eyes, oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer. This is my constant longing in prayer. Let me have eyes that are lifted in prayer to Father. But Jesus' eyes were also open eyes. There's a story that's always fascinated me. It's found in John 5. Jesus went to the pool of Bethesda. And the pool of Bethesda was interesting because the pool of Bethesda was said to occasionally, and probably what had happened is that the springs that fed it every once in a while, that it would bubble forth. And the thought was, read the text, and also sometimes it helps to read a little history, a little understanding. The thought was that when the pool was disturbed, that an angel of God had visited the pool, and that the first one that stepped into the pool, after it had been disturbed, the first one to step in it would be taken care of, healed of whatever malady they might have. And Jesus comes upon a man in John chapter 5 that has been laid daily by the pool of Bethesda, and guess what? He's still lame. And Jesus asked him, he says, you know, what are you doing here? Well, he says, well, I'm waiting for the pool to be disturbed. And I'm paraphrasing here. I'm waiting for it to be disturbed so that I can go in, but I have no one to take me to put me in there. And so invariably by the time I get there, somebody's already rushed in and gotten the blessing from it. So what does Jesus do? Take up your bed and walk. Sad to say that as you read that story in John chapter 5, Jesus is then criticized. Jesus is then rebuked. Why? Because he's told a man to do work on a day in which he shouldn't do work. And they say, the crowd is criticizing this, and they're asking the man, well, who told you? He said, well, the man that healed me. They should have shut up right then, but they didn't. And Jesus took the opportunity to teach the crowd where this power came from. His eyes were open to opportunity. In our lives, we have opportunity all the time. And sometimes we take advantage of that opportunity and sometimes we don't. You go back to the times in Jesus' life when he took the opportunity. You know, there was a question with regards to should you pay taxes or not? And Jesus asked for a coin. He says, whose image is on the coin? He took the opportunity to teach the lesson that he needed to teach. Jesus was constantly taking advantage of the opportunities that availed him to teach individuals and to teach groups. Admittedly, as we said, so many opportunities come our way, and so many times we let those opportunities pass. Not on purpose. It's because that light bulb didn't go off. We had a power failure. The light bulb didn't go off, and the opportunity passed. And when it passed, then we realized, oh, I had an opportunity, but I didn't do it. I didn't take advantage of it. But here's the key. Every opportunity that you have to say a word for the Lord, to the Lord, by the Lord, say it. Every time you have a chance to invite somebody to church, invite them. Anytime we have something special, Mission Sunday, the last Sunday of July, going to have a fellowship meal after. Boy, that's a good time. You know, you're going to get a free meal. Come on, be with us. Invite them to church. Invite them to come, not just on fellowship Sundays, but sometimes when we stay after on Sunday nights and eat, like we did the last Sunday night with regards to the singing, and then we had the ice cream supper the Sunday night before that, and we'll soon have some other things, watermelon bust, and we'll probably have a pie eating contest, not a contest, but some of us will make it a contest probably, but we'll eat pie after church one Sunday night. Invite you folks to come. Invite folks that are interested. But what about that friend that needs a little encouragement? How about sending them a verse of the Bible? While we were on vacation, you got to understand, Suzanne's idea of a vacation is shopping. Okay? Well, we went to several shops, and one of them we went into, I didn't buy it because of the price, but it was interesting because what it was literally sheets of paper, but each paper was really meant to be sent as a card, but on it was scripture. And I thought, yeah, our brethren need to do that. Just write a verse in the Bible, send it to somebody. Well, I can't find the appropriate one. Oh, yeah, you will. Just keep reading. You'll find one. Encourage people. But we have to be open to the opportunity. In Acts chapter 16, we're going to get there in a few weeks here in the auditorium class on Sunday mornings. But in Acts 16, when Paul, so to speak, is busted out of Philippian jailer, remember that story? Busted out of jail, so to speak. You know what he took the opportunity to do? He took the opportunity to take the jailer to go to his house and do what? To teach. As we therefore, Paul said in Galatians 6, verse 1, have opportunity. Let us do good unto all men, especially to those of the household of faith. We have to look for those opportunities, open our eyes to those opportunities. Maybe our prayer should be, Lord, keep my eyes open so that I see the opportunities, so that I can take advantage of them for you, so that I can be just like you. The eyes of Jesus, they were precious. They searched. There were times in which he lifted them up in prayer. He used those eyes as well to at times cry, but to also he kept his eyes open to affect the good of others. May we ever have those eyes that Jesus had. May we ever be individuals that keep our eyes peeled so that we can affect others for him. This morning, if you're not a New Testament child of God, or you're an individual that needs to come and ask for the prayers of the church, won't you come? All together we stand and sing.